I've started playing The Elder Scrolls Online after 3 years of almost complete absence from the game. This is the second part to a video I made earlier this week, in which I debated whether or not ESO is worth playing in 2018, according to the perspective of someone who's returned to the game and is comparing it to its original state. In this video I'm going to come to a conclusion. In the last part, I talked about my initial thoughts and expectations and featured some salient gameplay. In this second part, I'm going to go over the main points I think are worth considering, so suffice to say that this video is going to be much more concise and on point. I've played the game quite a bit more than I had done in the last video, so I definitely feel readier to come to a substantiated judgment. So let's get to it. Is ESO worth playing in 2018, especially for those who seek to make a return? Fundamentally, something that I think dearly holds back The Elder Scrolls Online in being able to be enjoyable for those who seek to return is the fact that ESO basically has the skin of an Elder Scrolls game, but it fundamentally isn't one. And I think this is the case for a few key reasons. Predominantly, this arises out of the fact that it is simply an MMO. It's not a single player RPG. Of course it's going to be different, it's got a different sales model, but in addition to that it lacks for true immersion and the game appears incredibly linear. It just doesn't feel like an Elder Scrolls game, you know, when you're immersed and you feel like you're in a completely different world. It just doesn't have that same feel, and it definitely doesn't feel as immersive for me. It just feels like an MMO set in the Elder Scrolls universe. An important point that I think sort of relates to this is rather minor, but you know, it does have an effect, and that's the naming of places in the game. So for example, when I was in Balmora, there was this one tavern, and in the Dragonborn DLC for Skyrim, for example, they had fairly authentic names, or not sophisticated, but I would argue authentic names like the Retching Netch and things like that, whereas in ESO it was called something weird like the Scurvy Netch or something like that, and it just sounded so sort of childish and like much less mature and less sort of immersive than in Morrowind and in the Dragonborn DLC. And that's just something that's hit me continually throughout the game. It's not a big point, it doesn't massively take away from it, especially because I sort of went into the game knowing it's not, you know, it's ESO, it's not a proper Elder Scrolls game, so it didn't bother me too much. But I can see if you were going into the game from the viewpoint that, you know, oh, it's just another Elder Scrolls game, that might hit you quite hard. And every now and again, you know, there's a lot of dialogue in the game. This is one of its main benefits. But equally, I feel like a lot of the dialogue, it feels quite shallow. You know, you're walking around and in Skyrim you'd hear these interesting conversations about what was happening at the time. But in ESO, I can't give any specific examples, but I've been wandering around thinking, why did they include that dialogue? It's just a very small point, but it's just these things sort of hit me. So we've gone through a few negatives about ESO, but there's one point that I think that's really resonated with me, and that's a particular strength of the game, and that's the quests. Although ESO may not be a true Elder Scrolls game, at least in my own eyes, that might not be your own opinion, but at least to me, despite this, the quests are still surprisingly interesting and good, and I think, and I'm not entirely sure, but I think they have improved with time. You know, 3 years ago, I found a lot of the quests bland and monotonous, but in the Morrowind chapter, I found them to be quite interesting, and this is true from the very beginning of the chapter. So when you first meet Vivek, there's a great aura of mystery surrounding the entire endeavour. You don't know who's siphoning away his power, and you're sort of given 3 broad aims to sort of look into, and I think that's a great way to go in terms of the quests. On the whole, even with the Marag Tong quest, which I just finished literally an hour ago, that quest line, it was just so enigmatic and interesting, and there's so many twists and turns. I actually really enjoyed it, and I'm surprised that I enjoyed it so much. Another example could be the one with the quest about the mine in Balmora. You help this guy out, you help him clear out his mine, only to find out that he's the villain. And again, I think that's really testimony to how much better the quests have become, and how less monotonous and how sort of interesting and compelling they are. And yeah, that's something that I think has definitely improved, at least within the Morrowind chapter. Maybe not with the rest of the game, but with the Morrowind chapter, I've just felt really pleased with the quests, and I've just wanted to keep on doing them, and it's really motivated me to play the game. So that's a massive plus for me. And another surprisingly good point about the game is to do with lore. Now, I never thought I'd catch myself talking about lore in relation to ESO, because previously I thought that it was a pretty soulless game and that it had no real lore or backstory. And whilst I do still think that a lot of the quests seem a bit not childish, but sort of bland and not as necessarily mature as their counterparts in Skyrim, Oblivion, Morrowind, there is still a lot of lore within the game, and it sort of pervades the entire atmosphere. I think it really does add to it. So for example, I found this book on Clavicus Vial, and I just looked at the first sentence. I was going to disregard it, I just thought it'd be a random book, just a few meaningless pages. But after I read the first sentence, I found it to be extremely interesting, and it was just this new information on Clavicus Vial, and it wasn't even strictly information, it was more speculation about the relationship between Vial and his dog. It was just about the link between them and speculating what that might be, and I found that to be quite interesting. And I finished it, I was thinking, wow, I wish there was more. Obviously they can't write full-length books within the game, that would take absolutely ages, but yeah, I just felt quite pleased, and I came away from that feeling quite elated about the game and more excited to explore the lore and actually pick up books and read them. And that is a massive plus for me, because I did the exact same thing in Oblivion and Skyrim and Morrowind. And again, I've already distinctly said that they're separate types of games, but it's great to see that there's still that element. I think it's good that they've continued with that element of lore, even though it is an MMO and it's, it's not sort of the same genre as such. Also, the game is fundamentally interesting. Even though it's not a true Elder Scrolls game, believe it or not, it is still quite interesting. It doesn't have to be a pure RPG that you play by yourself for it to be interesting. And I've talked about the lore and the quest already, but something I want to talk about are the classes and skill points and sort of the motivation to level up. It's completely and utterly different to Skyrim and Oblivion, and even though I personally think it's not necessarily as good, it fits with the MMO, but obviously I'm more into the single player RPGs, so I do prefer sort of Skyrim's method, but to a greater extent Oblivion and Morrowind's. But it's interesting. It's interesting to experiment with different classes and with different skill points and investing them, and there's a lot of advice online on how to go about it, so it's not a simple procedure. In Skyrim, it can be seen as quite simplistic, so I'd fundamentally say that it's quite interesting, at least to begin with so far, to level up and invest in different skill points and to take your character really in whichever direction you want to in terms of what weapons they use, what magic they use and things like that. Something I think is a great strength about the game, and I'd say it's quite well adapted to the Elder Scrolls Online as an MMO, to be honest. It's a good way of dealing with sort of skills and attributes in the context of an MMO. And specifically with the Morrowind chapter, I mean, the new Warden class is fine, it's pretty interesting, it's sort of quite similar to the others. I wouldn't say it's amazing, I wouldn't go out my way to buy the expansion because of it, but it's an interesting dynamic, it is cool, and I'm looking forward to the new class in the Somerset Isles. But for me, it's not a deciding factor. I got Morrowind because I wanted to get back into it, and the quests look quite interesting and things like that, so it's cool, but it's not amazing. So in link with that, the combat is interesting, but it's not amazing. I just have this overall feeling that it's not that solid. So in Skyrim, it obviously it's not real, but it felt a bit more immersive when you were attacking people, because it felt as if you were actually sort of attacking them and this sounds quite sadistic, but sort of hurting them and doing some damage. In ESO, it all seems quite detached. They're outlined in this red and you sort of attack them, but then your attack sort of automatically goes to them. There's sort of this automatic trajectory with bows and with spells, and to an extent with melee weapons as well, and it just doesn't feel as, it just lacks a certain tenacity, I think. Like, it's interesting, it's not bad at all. It might lack in its solid feeling, but I think it makes up with that a little bit in terms of the way that you can sort of combine the different skills and your ultimate abilities. Like, that's interesting, but the combat in itself, and I think this is mostly to do with the engine, just lacks that sort of tenacity and that solid feeling, and that's really depreciated the entertainment of combat for me. Yeah, that's a bit disappointing. Although Skyrim was a bit bland, I have to admit that, the combat wasn't amazing, but there's just this feeling of depth and this feeling you're actually in there and you're doing some real damage. In ESO, I don't necessarily get that feeling. I feel quite detached. It's more just sort of spamming buttons, and it's interesting, it's cool, but it's not amazing. Although, that being said, ESO does offer a wide variety of choice, so you're not just always going to be fighting with the same weapons. So for example, before I've always gone with melee or magic, but in this playthrough for the first ever time I've started using a bow, and I found that quite fun. Even though it's not amazing, it's not that solid, it has been interesting, and I've enjoyed developing my sort of bow skills along the warden class, something that's quite unique, but yeah, it just lacks that solid feeling. And a major positive for the game is the soundtrack. Both Morrowind and the base ESO game have just an amazing soundtrack, and although not all the tracks are by Jeremy Soule, quite a lot of them are, but not all of them, I still think it's quite good, and it does add to how immersive I think the game is. All in all, to enjoy The Elder Scrolls Online, you have to realise that it's not Skyrim or Oblivion or Morrowind. It's an MMO that is set in the Elder Scrolls universe. If you go into it with no preconceptions, granted that is difficult, then no doubt you will find it fun. But if you're like me and you dearly love the main Elder Scrolls games, I have to honestly say that it's quite hard to initially get into and appreciate ESO. But if you go into it with a fairly open mind and realise it is an MMO, then you should easily be able to get some enjoyment out of it. Anyway guys, I've been Avarti, and thanks for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one.